Hello students, we're going to complete our examination of the United States in World War II by looking at the impact of World War II on the U.S., on the world, and particularly on the U.S.'s place in the world. We want to first start by looking at the planning of the post-war world. And because World War II was a war that was fought to the bitter end, unlike World War I, Nazi Germany does not surrender until Hitler commits suicide. Japan, not until the atomic bombs are dropped. This will be unconditional surrender on both sides, and it will take longer to complete, but their defeat will be total. So as the war is starting to wind down, it's becoming clear that the Allies are going to win, but the war is still going on. We see a couple of international conferences to plan that post-war world. The first of these is in February 1945 at Yalta. And at this conference, we see the big three. From left, Winston Churchill, Prime Minister of England, the UK. Franklin Roosevelt there in the middle, President of the United States. Joseph Stalin next to him. And then, of course, on the end, Vermont Senator Bernie Sanders. At this conference, they agreed to a couple of major goals that we need to keep in mind. One is that Poland, Bulgaria, and Romania, all three Eastern European countries that had been conquered by the Germans and reconquered then by the Soviet Union coming in from the east, would hold free elections. Stalin is later going to renege on this promise and refuse to allow free elections in there, and in fact come to sort of dominate most of Eastern Europe. And the second was that the Soviet Union promised to help fight Japan after Germany surrendered. So the United States and Britain had come to an agreement in the Atlantic Charter that they would first fight Germany and then turn to Japan. But the Soviet Union was not part of that agreement. Here we get sort of a tacit agreement from Stalin that he will join. The second of these conferences comes in July of the same year, 1945. This is after Germany has surrendered, and it is in Potsdam, a suburb of Berlin. By this point, we see some changes in who's present. Winston Churchill has been replaced as prime minister by Clement Attlee. Franklin Roosevelt has died, and so Harry Truman, his vice president, has become president. But Joseph Stalin is still there. At the Potsdam Conference, they agreed to divide Germany and its capital, Berlin, into 4 occupation zones: a British zone, American zone, French zone, and a Soviet zone. So the country itself was divided up, and then Berlin would also be divided up into separate zones. And this is going to become important in our next topic when we look at the Cold War. There would be a new set of borders for Poland, as well as an agreement for free elections there. Although Poland does not regain all the land it had before it was conquered by Germany and the Soviet Union does get to keep some of the land that they had taken from Poland. They recognized the Soviet Union's right to claim reparations from Germany for the war damages, at least from the part of Germany that they occupied, which is Eastern Germany. And then Stalin reaffirmed a little bit more clearly this time his promise to join the fight against Japan, which the Soviet Union will do, but they kind of hesitate for a little bit. It's only going to be just before the United States drops the atomic bomb, bringing an end to the war. We're going to see 3 major changes to the post-World War II world, so the international impact of this. The first is we're setting up the Cold War, which will come in its wake, where the world becomes divided between communist nations and democratic nations, and the U.S. sort of becomes the leader of the democratic world, and the Soviet Union the leader of the communist world, or at least viewed in that fashion. Eastern Europe, most of Eastern Europe will become communist states, under the control of the Soviet Union, referred to as satellite states. When these areas had been conquered by the Germans, the Soviets reconquered them and refused to pull back from them and set up communist governments in these nations that would be loyal to the Soviet Union. And we'll get more into that in the next topic. Germany is going to remain divided. The U.S., Britain, and France will reunite the western halves into one country, Western Germany, West Germany, which will be a primarily democratic state, but the Soviet Union will refuse to give up its occupied zone in East, setting up a communist government in East Germany. China's civil war, which had been fought between the nationalists and the communists before the invasion of Japan, was sort of set aside to fight Japan. It will be resumed afterwards. So there will be a struggle between the nationalists and communist Chinese once again. And the U.S. is going to set up a liberal constitutional democracy in Japan, because the U.S. has full occupation of Japan after the war. And General MacArthur, who will be put in charge of that, almost single-handedly sets up Japan's new government. And they will become one of the leading democracies in the world that they are today. The second big difference is that the war is going to weaken imperialism worldwide. Now, this colonization and colonies was really kind of on the decline before the world began. But the aggressive expansion of Japan and Germany really kind of soured the world on this idea of imperialism and on the abuses that came along with it. Colonial peoples in Africa, the Middle East, and East Asia and Southern Asia began to renew their calls for independence. Many of these people had sort of set aside those calls during the war to help fight for the colonizing countries. So there were a lot of, for example, Indians who fought in World War II for the British Army, because India at the time was a colony of Britain. But now we're going to see India, as well as many other African colonies and Asian and Middle Eastern colonies, pushing once again for independence. And this was something that Roosevelt had supported with the Atlantic Charter. And much of the territory taken by Japan had been European colonies, but it will become independent after the war. They will start to become independent nations. We'll start to see decolonization in Africa and the Middle East at a much slower pace after this. One notable exception in East Asia is French Indochina, which includes the nation today of Vietnam. And that's going to be important to us later on, because how it will involve us in a war there. Lastly, this polarized world is led by the two new superpowers, world-dominating superpower nations, which would be the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, the United States is by far the more powerful of the two after the war, in particular because the war is not fought in the United States. So we don't have to rebuild like the Soviet Union and much of Europe and East Asia will have to do. And our industry boomed during the war, pulling us out of the Great Depression. And at this point, and at the end of the war in 1945, the United States is still the only nation that has access to the atomic bomb. The Soviet Union, however, was still powerful militarily. It had the Red Army, the Soviet Army, which was the largest in the world. And at the war's end, they remained in control of pretty much all of Eastern Europe. We're also going to see a lot of international treaties and organizations come out of the ashes of World War II. It is the most destructive war in human history, and then throw on top of that, the shocking atrocities of the Japanese Imperial Army and the Holocaust. And there's a lot of desire to prevent another such incident from occurring in a much more concerted effort than we saw after the First World War, to bring about a sort of new world order where we didn't have large-scale worldwide wars. On the economic front, and actually many of these areas, we're going to see the United States starting to emerge as a leader. The U.S. will host the Bretton Woods Conference, in which the United States will set up funding of some economic agreements, among them the International Monetary Fund, or IMF, which is going to peg the value of other nations' currency to the value of the dollar. So now everything's, the value of, say, the British pound or the French franc will be measured based on its relationship to the strength of the U.S. dollar. And it will also create the World Bank, which will loan money to nations after that, and continues to exist today. Also on the lines of economics is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, or GATT. This will lower tariffs. Nations will all agree to lower their tariffs, and it's going to increase world trade. And for the United States and many other nations, this is going to prove to be a very prosperous agreement. This is later going to be replaced by the WTO, or the World Trade Organization, in 1995. Very importantly, the United Nations is going to be formed out of this in a replacement of the League of Nations. It is given much more authority than the League of Nations did, although it still is not a military organization. But the United Nations is also designed around preserving the prominence of the great powers of the world at the time. So it creates a Security Council where the United States, Soviet Union, Britain, France, and China all have permanent seats. And then there are 5 other nations that rotate, or they will rotate other members of the UN into the other 5 seats. And that council can veto any resolution passed by the United Nations at large. So it does preserve some of the power of the more powerful nations over the rest of the world. The United Nations is there to facilitate cooperation between the nations and to prevent a third world war. And for all of its potential flaws, the UN has stood, and we have not had another great war on the scale of the First or Second World Wars. And also, it starts to promote human rights. For the first time, we start to see an internationally accepted definition of those basic human rights that we kind of outlined in the Declaration of Independence: life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness, but also, opposition to slavery and torture and other things, and the idea of a free society for all. Lastly, we'll see war crimes trials for Japan and for Germany. This picture here is from the Nuremberg trials, which were trying Nazi war criminals for some of the atrocities of the Holocaust. And this will establish the idea that, in a court of law, international law, you cannot claim following orders as a defense. Many of the Nazis tried to do this, but there's this idea of conscience that you cannot just, if you see something wrong, you can ignore an unlawful or immoral order, and should do so. We'll see hundreds of Nazis executed, and many more imprisoned for their role in the Holocaust. In Japan, there will be hundreds who will be given the death sentence, as well as many more punished in other ways for some of their wartime atrocities in Nanjing, Manchuria, China, and throughout the Pacific, including Hideki Tojo, the Prime Minister. Domestically, within our country, World War II marks the end of America's policy of isolationism. Americans begin to see themselves much more as a leader in the world, and start to look at their lives more in a global sense, recognizing that national security is also tied to world security. We'll see a much more involved United States. World War II is going to end the Great Depression in the United States and usher in decades of economic growth. War industries encouraged wealth and migration, particularly to the West and the South. The U.S. government is going to take on a greater role in the economy, and the power of the presidency is greatly expanded under Roosevelt in World War II. And then lastly, this offers a boost to pushes and calls for equality and civil rights in the United States, as mentioned before with the Double V campaign. Our willingness to fight fascism abroad translates into fighting for equal rights back home. All right, I love you. Bye-bye. Lest I forget, here's an example answer for your graphic organizer. Now, bye-bye.